Imagine you are the heir to one of the oldest thrones in Europe. You have known this since before you could walk. Every room you enter, every person you meet, every decision made about your education, your diet, your daily movements, all of it has been organized around a single fact. One day, you will be king. Now imagine that from the very first days of your life, the people around you have known something else. Something they speak about in whispers, in private consultations, in careful letters that are not meant to be seen. Something that changes the way they look at you when they think you are not watching. A mixture of love and grief and calculation that a child learns to read long before he has words for what he is reading. Your blood does not clot. A bruise that fades in a day for another child can kill you. A fall that another boy walks away from can trigger internal bleeding that does not stop. The ordinary violence of childhood, the scrapes and tumbles that are how children learn to inhabit their bodies, is for you a map of territories you must navigate around, carefully, always, for the rest of your life. You are the heir to the throne of Spain. You are also the child the dynasty does not know what to do with, loved absolutely, grieved quietly, assessed constantly, and never quite able to be only the son and never the problem. Now imagine that one day, in a drawing room in Rome, you meet a woman who looks at you without any of that. What would you do? Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, answered that question in 1933. He renounced his claim to the Spanish throne, married the woman his family would never fully accept, crossed the Atlantic, and tried to build an ordinary life. He was 26 years old. He had given up everything that had been decided for him before he was born. He had 5 years of that ordinary life before a car accident that should not have been fatal killed him at 31. Because his blood had never clotted properly, not once. Because of a mutation that had traveled from Queen Victoria's genome through his mother's veins and into his, and that no amount of love or freedom or distance from the palace could undo. Whether the choice he made was the most romantic decision in the history of the Spanish monarchy or the most tragic, depends on where you stand when you look at it. It was probably both. Madrid, May 10, 1907. The city was celebrating. The birth of a male heir to King Alfonso C was not merely a family event, it was a political event, a dynastic event, a demonstration that the Bourbon line would continue, that Spain had its future secured, that the marriage between Alfonso C and Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, the English princess who had converted to Catholicism and crossed from one world into another to marry the young king, had produced exactly what a monarchy requires. A son, an heir, a Prince of Asturias. The celebrations were genuine, and the relief was real, and nobody in the room, not the king, not the queen, not the doctors, not the courtiers, knew yet what the circumcision wound was about to reveal. It would not stop bleeding. For hours it would not stop, and the silence that settled over the royal household in the days that followed was the silence of people who understood, slowly and then all at once, that the heir to the throne of Spain had inherited something from his mother that no one had anticipated. Something that had no cure. Something that would shape every day of his life from that morning forward. Hemophilia. The blood did not clot. The platelets gathered and dispersed and gathered again, and the wound stayed open. And the doctors worked through the night, and eventually they managed it. And the baby survived, and the king was told that his son had a delicacy, a fragility, a condition that would require management. He was not told the full truth immediately. Perhaps the full truth was too large for that particular morning. Queen Ina, lying in the aftermath of labor, 21 years old, and in a country that was not yet fully hers, had not known. She had carried the mutation in her cells since her own birth, inherited from her mother Princess Beatrice, who had inherited it from her mother Queen Victoria, who had carried it unknowingly through a long and formidable reign without ever knowing it was there. The mutation had been invisible in every woman who carried it. It expressed itself only in sons. Ina had not known she was passing it forward. That is the fact that matters most in her story, and it is also the fact that her husband Alfonso Sihi was never fully able to hold on to, in the shock and grief of what the diagnosis meant for the dynasty he had expected to secure. He said something to her. The exact words are disputed, possibly apocryphal, but the shape of what he said is recorded in enough accounts to suggest it was real. Something to the effect that she had given him a son who could not be king. The words, whatever they precisely were, landed like a verdict. Not a medical diagnosis, a verdict. On her body, on the invisible letter in her cells that she had not chosen and could not undo. She stayed. She always stayed. But something changed that day in the architecture of their marriage, a hairline fracture that would widen over the years, and the boy who had been born into it, the boy lying in the nursery with the wound that would not close, grew up inside that fracture, shaped by understanding it long. Before he had words for what he understood, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, grew up knowing that his body was a negotiation, not in those words. Children do not have those words. But in the way that children know things before they can articulate them, in the careful way people moved around him, in the things he was not allowed to do that other boys did without thinking, in the particular quality of attention that his mother directed at him, watchful and warm and always, slightly anxious in a way that she could not entirely conceal. He could not run the way other boys ran. He could not fall the way other boys fell and simply get up and keep going. A bruise that would fade in a day on an ordinary child could, in Alfonso, trigger internal bleeding that was difficult to stop and occasionally life-threatening. A cut that required a plaster for most people required hours of intervention for him. The ordinary physics of childhood, the scrapes and tumbles and rough games that are how children learn their bodies, were for Alfonso a map of territories he had to navigate around rather than through. His mother taught him chess. She read to him for hours. She taught him languages. He learned 4 before he was 10, because language was somewhere you could travel without bleeding. When he asked, as children do ask, why he was different, she told him what she had decided to tell him, that some people are built for speed, and some are built for depth, and that depth was the rarer gift. She did not know if she believed this. She said it anyway. He was a serious child. Observers who recorded their impressions of him use that word, serious, with a consistency that suggests it was not a performance but a genuine quality. The gravity of a person who has absorbed early the reality of his own fragility and decided not to be destroyed by it. He read voraciously. He was curious about everything: history, mechanics, architecture, the world outside the palace walls that he could see from his windows but moved through only carefully, with attendance, with the constant low-level management of risk that was the operational texture of his life. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew him, charming. Not the performed charm of a prince trained for public occasions. Genuine warmth, a quickness of intelligence, a quality of paying full attention to whoever was speaking to him that people found surprising and then disarming. He had inherited his father's physical presence and his mother's stillness, and the combination produced someone who occupied a room differently than other people. He knew what was expected of him. He was the Prince of Asturias, the heir to the throne of Spain, the embodiment of the Bourbon dynasty's future. He had been told this since before he could walk. The crown was not an abstraction for him. It was a weight he had been carrying since birth, the same weight his mother had carried when she crossed from England to Spain and converted her faith and gave up the world she knew to become the queen of a country that was not entirely sure it wanted her. He watched his parents. He watched the hairline fracture in their marriage that had been there since his birth. He watched his father's restlessness and his mother's composure, and the gap between them that widened almost imperceptibly over the years, but was always there, always legible to anyone who was paying attention. And Alfonso was always paying attention. He had learned to pay attention the way people learn anything that matters, because the alternative was dangerous. Spain in the 1920s was not a stable country. It had never entirely been a stable country, in the way that a kingdom built from the forced unification of competing regions and the violent suppression of religious diversity, and then stripped of its empire in the space of a few decades, and subjected to the particular chaos of the early 20th century. Anarchism, socialism, regionalist movements, military adventurism, the perpetual tension between a conservative church and a secular left could not easily find its footing. Alfonso Xi governed with an energy that observers found either impressive or exhausting, depending on their politics. He made decisions quickly and changed them quicker. He was personally brave. He had survived multiple assassination attempts with a composure that seemed to be genuine rather than performed, including the bomb on his wedding day that had killed 23 people in the street around him and left his bride's wedding dress soaked in other people's blood. He had held her hand in the wreckage. He had survived and continued surviving. But survival as a political strategy has limits. In 1923, facing a military crisis in Morocco and growing domestic instability, Alfonso Xi acquiesced to, some historians would say enabled, the coup of General Primo de Rivera, who established a military dictatorship that governed Spain for the next 7 years. The king who had acquiesced to the coup remained on his throne while the constitution he had sworn to uphold was suspended, and this fact accumulated in the political consciousness of Spain like silt behind a dam, quiet and invisible and increasingly structural. When Primo de Rivera fell in 1930, when the municipal elections of April 1931 returned results that were so overwhelmingly Republican that even the military declined to support the monarchy, Alfonso Xi left Spain. He did not formally abdicate. He announced that he was leaving to avoid the violence that his remaining might cause, leaving Spaniards free to decide their own form of government. He left on April 14, 1931, and he never came back. His son Alfonso, the Prince of Asturias, was 23 years old. He had grown up understanding that the throne he was being prepared to inherit was not a stable thing. He had watched the politics fracture and reassemble and fracture again. He had watched his father govern with exhausting energy and insufficient wisdom, accumulating the debts that would eventually come due. He was old enough to understand what his father's departure meant, and young enough that his understanding of it was still mostly emotional. The particular vertigo of watching the entire structure you were born to inherit simply cease to exist. The family scattered. Alfonso Xi went to Rome. The children dispersed across European capitals, staying with relatives, maintaining the reduced court in exile that former monarchies maintain in the years when they still believe return is possible. Alfonso went with them. And somewhere in the dispersal, in the years of exile, in the particular freedom of a prince without a throne, he met a woman. Her name was Edelmira San Pedro Osejo y Robato. She was Cuban. She was not a noblewoman. She was not a princess, not a duchess, not anyone that a European royal house would have considered an acceptable match for the heir to the Spanish throne under any ordinary circumstances. She was exactly the person Alfonso wanted to marry. They had met in Rome, in the exile social world that gathered former royals and European aristocrats and wealthy South Americans into the same drawing rooms in the early 1930s. Edelmira was the daughter of a prosperous Cuban family, educated, poised, with the particular confidence of someone who had grown up in money without growing up in courts, which meant she had the assurance without the performance, the ease without the armor. What Alfonso felt when he met her is not recorded in the way that the feelings of princes are usually not recorded, in private letters that have not survived, in conversations that no one was taking notes on, in the interior experience of a person that the historical record cannot fully access. What the record shows is the shape of the feeling. He wanted to marry her. He was told he could not, and he decided to do it anyway. The opposition was immediate and total. His father, Alfonso Xi, was furious. the exiled Spanish court, the people who had followed the king into Rome and who maintained the rituals and hierarchies of a monarchy that no longer had a country, was scandalized. Marrying a Cuban commoner was not simply a personal choice, it was a political statement, a renunciation of everything the succession represented, a refusal of the role that had been assigned to him since before he could remember. There were negotiations. There were conversations in which the political stakes were laid out with great thoroughness. The exile court needed to present itself as a legitimate alternative to the republic that now governed Spain, needed to maintain the appearances and protocols of monarchy, needed an heir whose marriage would strengthen rather than compromise the claim. Alfonso heard all of this. He had heard versions of it his entire life. His body was the first place the claim had been compromised. The hemophilia that his mother had not known she was passing on had made him, in the quiet assessment of the court, an uncertain vessel for the dynasty's future. He had lived with that assessment for 26 years. He had built a life inside it. He had decided, in whatever wordless way people decide the things that matter most, that he was not going to spend whatever time he had in the service of a dynasty that had never fully known what to do with him. In June 1933, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, formally renounced his rights of succession to the Spanish throne. The statement he issued was simple. He could not fulfill the obligations the succession required. He was going to live his life differently. He offered no elaborate justification, no extensive public explanation of the private calculations that had brought him to this point. He said what needed to be said, and he let the court make of it what it would. He married Edelmira in the same month. The response in the exile court was what responses in exile courts usually are: disproportionate, consuming, and ultimately powerless to change anything. His father raged. His name was removed from the succession. His younger brother Jaime had already renounced his own rights. Jaime had been born deaf, and had later become mute after a failed surgical attempt to treat an ear infection, and had stepped back from the succession with the plain statement that he could not hear the country he was meant to serve. That left the succession to the third brother, Juan, who was healthy, whose blood clotted normally, who had not inherited the mutation, and who would eventually become the Count of Barcelona and the father of Juan Carlos I. Alfonso watched this from a distance that was, in the early months at least, geographic as well as emotional. He and Edelmira moved to Cuba, her country, the country where her family was, and where their life together would be built. He was 26 years old, and he had given up the most prestigious title in Spain, and he was starting over in Havana. The accounts of him in Cuba describe a man who was, by the standards available to him, happy. Not the happiness of someone who has escaped a bad situation, the particular quieter happiness of someone who has stopped performing a role that was never quite right for them and discovered what their actual life feels like. He worked. He found employment in legitimate business, because the money that came with exile was not limitless, and he had made choices that had narrowed his access to the family resources. He drove. He went to parties. He was known in Havana's social circles as charming and direct, and completely unpretentious in the way that people who have given up enormous amounts of prestige sometimes become, as though the giving up of it freed them from needing to perform it. His hemophilia was always present. It was always the background condition against which everything else was arranged. The careful avoidance of certain activities, the management of minor injuries with the attention that other people gave to major ones. The knowledge, bone deep and impossible to entirely set aside, that the body he was living in had a fundamental fragility that no amount of happiness or freedom could change. He had probably always known, in some part of himself, that the life he was living was likely to be shorter than ordinary. The mathematics of hemophilia in 1933, before blood transfusions were routine, before clotting factors were identified and synthesized, before the full medical apparatus that now makes hemophilia manageable existed, meant that serious injury or surgery was a gamble, and that minor injuries could become serious with a speed that was difficult to predict and impossible to fully protect against. He managed it as well as it could be managed. He built a life inside its constraints. He chose Edelmira and Havana and the ordinary pleasures of a life lived without the performance of monarchy. And for 5 years that life held. The marriage to Edelmira did not last. The reasons are not fully clear from the historical record. The private interior of a marriage is almost always invisible from the outside, and the distance of 9 decades makes the invisibility more complete. What is recorded is that they separated. Alfonso found himself alone again in a different way than he had been alone before. With the complications of the separation added to the complications of exile and the complications of a body that demanded constant management, he moved to Miami. This detail matters, though the histories rarely pause on it. Miami in the late 1930s was a different city from what it would become. Smaller, quieter, a resort town on the edge of the subtropical American South, without the Cuban diaspora that would transform it in the decades after the revolution, without the particular cultural density it would acquire. For Alfonso, it was a place to be relatively anonymous, a warm climate that was easier on a body that had never been fully robust, a city far enough from the exile court in Rome, from the fading grandeur of the Spanish monarchy in exile, from the weight of everything he had renounced. He was 30 years old. He had given up a throne. He had married and separated. He had crossed the Atlantic twice. He had built and dismantled and begun rebuilding a life that was his own, imperfect and unscripted and entirely outside the role that had been prepared for him. Then he was in a car accident. September 1938. Miami. It was not a serious accident, by the standards of car accidents. A collision. The kind that happens every day in every city. The kind that leaves most people shaken and bruised and grateful that it was not worse. Alfonso was bruised and shaken. The bruise was on his arm. In an ordinary body, it would have faded in a week. In Alfonso's body, the bruise did not fade. The bleeding beneath the skin that a bruise represents, the small vessels broken by impact, leaking into surrounding tissue, did not stop. His body did not have the mechanism to stop it. The clotting cascade that ordinary bodies run automatically, the complex biochemical process that seals damaged vessels and allows healing to begin, was broken in him at a fundamental level. It had always been broken. It would always be broken. The car accident had simply created the occasion for the breaking to express itself in a way that could not be managed with the tools available. The internal bleeding spread. Doctors were called. Interventions were attempted. Alfonso was admitted to hospital with the particular combination of urgency and helplessness that characterized hemophilia treatment in 1938, the knowledge that something was wrong, the inability to address the underlying cause, the management of symptoms while the body continued to do the thing it could not be stopped from doing. He died on September 6, 1938. He was 31 years old. He was buried in Miami, quietly, without the ceremony that a prince of Asturias might in other circumstances have received. The exile court in Rome mourned with the mixture of grief and complexity that attends the death of someone who had made choices the court had not approved of. His father, Alfonso Seith, who had spent 7 years being furious about the renunciation and the marriage and the departure from everything the succession required, received the news in Rome and was, by the accounts of those around him, simply devastated. Whatever the disagreements between them, whatever the long, difficult silence of a father and son on opposite sides of a decision that had cost them both something, Alfonso C. had loved his son, and his son was dead at 31, of a wound too small for an ordinary body to die of. His mother, Ina, in exile by then herself. Alfonso C. Heath had left Spain in 1931, and the family had dispersed across Europe, received the news in Lausanne. She sat with it alone. Then she wrote him a letter she could not send, the way mothers write to children who have died, because the writing is its own way of refusing to accept that the conversation is over. No one knows what she wrote. She burned it afterward. There is a question that the story of Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, raises and does not fully answer, and it is this. Was the choice he made in 1933 an act of courage or an act of despair? The standard reading is romantic. He loved a woman his family would not accept. He chose love over the throne. He gave up everything for something real. This is a good story. It has been a good story for 90 years, and it will probably continue to be one. But there is another reading, quieter and less comfortable, that the evidence supports equally well. Alfonso grew up knowing his body was an uncertain vessel for the dynasty. He had been told, in ways that were never direct but were always clear, that his hemophilia made him a complicated heir, not officially disqualified, never openly dismissed, but the subject of calculations that no one made in his presence, and everyone made behind it. He had watched his father look at him with a love that was complicated by grief. Because Alfonso C. understood what the hemophilia meant, and could not entirely separate that understanding from the way he looked at his son. He had watched his mother carry the weight of a guilt she did not deserve, and could not set down. He was 26 years old, and he had a throne he could not fully inhabit, a dynasty that needed him to be something his body could not guarantee, a family that loved him through the specific difficulty of loving someone who represents both hope and disappointment simultaneously. And he met a woman in Rome who looked at him without any of that, who saw Alfonso rather than the Prince of Asturias, who was not doing calculations about succession and bloodlines and the political optics of the marriage she was considering, who simply, as far as the record can show, wanted to be with him. The renunciation may have been about Edelmira. It may also have been about everything else, about the exhaustion of being the heir to something that had never quite been able to decide what to do with him, about the freedom of stepping out of the role and discovering whether there was a person inside it who could live his own life. Both things can be true simultaneously, the love and the relief, the choice for something and the choice away from something, the romance and the reckoning. Here is what the inheritance cannot know. It cannot know what it will produce. The mutation that traveled from Queen Victoria's genome through Princess Beatrice into Ina, into Alfonso, did not know it was ending a dynasty. It did not know it was writing the precise condition under which a prince would die at 31 in Miami from a car accident that should not have been fatal. It did not know any of the human things that happened inside the chain of consequences it set in motion. It was just a letter in a text 3 billion letters long, copied incorrectly once, and then faithfully forward from that point into every generation that followed, arriving finally here, in a hospital room in a Florida city in the last year before the world went to war, in the body of a man who had given up a throne and was dying of a bruise. He had chosen love over the crown. He had chosen ordinary life over the performance of monarchy. He had crossed the Atlantic and built something small and real out of whatever was available to him, and he had had 5 years of it before the accident. Whether 5 years was enough is a question only he could answer, and he cannot answer it now. What can be said is that he lived those years as himself, not as the Prince of Asturias, not as the heir to the Bourbon dynasty, not as the embodiment of a claim that had been assessed and calibrated since before he could speak. As Alfonso, simply Alfonso. A man in Miami with a complicated past and a body that demanded careful management, and a life that was, within those constraints, his own. The throne he renounced still does not exist in the form he would have inherited. Spain became a republic, and then a dictatorship under Franco, and then a constitutional monarchy restored through his nephew Juan Carlos I, the son of his brother Juan, the healthy one, the one the mutation had missed. The line passed through Juan and arrived at a king who in 1981 stood before the cameras during a military coup attempt and ordered the soldiers to stand down, in a speech so plain and so unafraid that the coup collapsed. That king was Alfonso's nephew. The dynasty continued. It just continued through a different branch, by a different route, in a country transformed beyond recognition from the one Alfonso C. had left in 1931. Alfonso never saw any of it. He died in a Florida hospital at 31, 1 year before the Second World War began, with his nephew Juan Carlos already born 8 months earlier, 37 years before that nephew became king. He is buried in Miami, not in the Escorial, where Spanish kings lie in their marble chambers in the mountains outside Madrid. Not in Granada, where Ferdinand and Isabella lie side by side. Not in any of the places that the history of the monarchy would have designated for him. In Miami, quietly, in the city where he had tried to build an ordinary life and had almost managed it. There are worse places to end a story. There are worse things to be remembered for than choosing, once with full knowledge of what it cost, the thing you actually wanted instead of the thing that had been decided for you before you were born. He chose. Whatever else can be said about what followed, the separation, the loneliness, the accident, the room in Miami, the death at 31. He chose. And for a man who had been chosen for everything since the moment he arrived, that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything.